Okay, now we're going to complicate it a little. Residual value risk. What is residual value risk?
You don't know for certain what the value's going to be after 4 years.
Exactly. So this Metro Healthcare thinks it will be able to sell the X-ray machine for $100,000 4 years from now. Is that certain? I don't think so. Most equipment that healthcare organizations purchase, they have a pretty good estimate of what they might be able to get in the residual value, but there's a high level of uncertainty, particularly in high technology equipment. Why is that so? Right, because you got a real great whiz-bang scanner today. It may be worth nothing 3 years from now because it's been replaced by a new generation. So high-tech equipment tends to have a lot more residual risk than dishwashing equipment or laundry and washer and dryer equipment in the laundry. So the way you account for that in leasing analysis is to have a different discount rate which you apply to the residual value, because to reflect the fact that it's higher relative risk than the other cash flows. So in this example, we've discounted all our operating cash flows, the leasing and the debt cash flows at 6%. Now we're just going to put in a 10% discount rate on the residual value cash flows because it's a lot riskier. And if we do that, the net advantage to leasing increases from $22,000 to $28,000. Why does that happen? Does that make sense to you?
Risk and return.
Sorry?
Higher risk, greater return.
Yes. So what's happening here? What we're saying is if we recognize the residual value risk, leasing looks even better. Why is that?
Sell it.
Right?
Because you don't have to sell it afterwards.
That's right, because the selling the asset only applies to owning. It doesn't apply to leasing. So before, we assumed that we discounted the $100,000 by 6% because we thought it was the same risk as the other cash flows. Now we're looking at the fact, really that $100,000 is not a sure thing, and therefore there's a lot more risk associated with that. We're going to use a higher discount rate. The net proceeds from owning go down. So the advantage to leasing goes up. So generally speaking, leasing, one of the types of equipment that leasing is more frequently used for is high-tech equipment where there is a lot of uncertainty about the residual value at the end of the life of the asset. The lessor owns the equipment, therefore it's hired. It's essentially passed from the lessee to the lessor, and that makes the lease more attractive to the hospital or the health system or whoever is leasing the asset. In fact, the value of a leased asset, if you calculate the net present value of a particular piece of equipment, you find that it's negative. In fact, if you have a great leasing deal that's got a fairly large positive present value to it, that in fact can swing an undesirable project to a desirable project. So sometimes you have to be careful about including the benefits or the implications of financing to the project selection. Something that's become popular in the last few years are per procedure leases. And what this is essentially it passes some of the operating risk from the lessee to the lessor. So when you lease an asset, you've got the MRI or the scanner in your radiology department. You only get revenue from it if you actually use it, and your costs continue. Well, a per procedure lease, essentially, you only pay a cost on the machine when you use it. So you basically convert a lot of the cost of the financing cost of the asset from a fixed cost to a variable cost. That's a great reduction in the amount of risk to the lessee because it relieves you of the pressure of having minimum volumes in order to recover the costs of financing the asset. However, lessors are not dumb. What will lessors do to compensate for that risk? Yeah, they'll have to, per procedure leases tend to be more expensive than perhaps another conventional type of lease, because the lessors want to cover the risk of utilization being lower than expected. Okay, so that's what we talked about now are the lessees analyses that all of you would go through as a healthcare organization. We're going to talk just a minute on what is a leasing company, what kind of negotiations, what kind of analysis are they going through, because this is a game, this is a dance that you will do with the leasing company. There's only two parties to the transaction, you and the leasing company. And we'll talk in the next week when you do the case. You'll do a lot of numbers, but you'll also think about some of the non-financial kinds of things that are going on in leasing as well. But right now, let's look at the kind of analysis the lessor is going to do. So the lessor, the lessee is looking at leasing as a financing alternative. The lessor is looking at leasing as an investment. Do I want to give this healthcare organization some money? Am I going to make a return on my investment? So let's say we've got consolidated leasing here, and we're just going to jack up the $300,000 for a second and see what happens. So here are the lessor's cash flows. Again, most of them, what do you notice about them compared to the lessee's cash flows?
They're the same.
They look pretty much the same. And that is because there's two parties to the transaction. What is a cost inflow, cash inflow to the leasing company is a cash outflow to the healthcare organization, and vice versa. We've monkeyed around with leasing payment. We've jacked up to 280 to 300 just for purpose of showing what happens here. So here the net cash flows to the lessor. The lessor will discount that at 6%, and they get exactly the same NPV as the healthcare organization. The IRR is 7.35%. Should the lessor write the lease with a positive NPV and an IRR of 7.35%?
What do you mean by write the lease? What's that? Okay.
Should they offer the lease?
No.
It's got a positive NPV of 21,875, and it's got an IRR 7.35%. Sarah says yes.
Yeah.
It's got a positive NPV. 7.35% should be compared to what?
6.
Right, and that's why it's getting you're getting the same answer as the organization. If the healthcare organization, leasing company, had exactly the same tax rates, had exactly the same estimates of residual value, had the same estimate of residual value risk, the NPV would be the opposite. Only it would be the same number as the healthcare organization, but with a negative sign. And the reason is that leasing is a zero-sum game, because there's two parties to the transaction. Every cash inflow is a cash outflow. If all the inputs are the same on both sides, both the leasing company, the lessor and the lessee face exactly the same tax rates, the same cost of capital, the same residual value risks, same residual estimates of the discount rate. If everything is the same on both sides, then it's got to be a zero-sum game, because they have exactly the same cash inflows and outflows. The only way that leasing doesn't result in this, and why leasing happens at all, is because there is asymmetry in those inputs. They have different tax rates, they face different costs of capital, they face different residual value risks. That's what produces the value to leasing, the benefits to leasing. So that both parties can gain if they've got asymmetry in their inputs. If they do not have asymmetry, there is no gain to leasing. Or at least if there is a gain to one, it'll be equal and opposite loss to the other. Does everybody follow that? So in the real world, leasing is beneficial to both healthcare organizations and leasing companies because they face different tax rates, they face different interest rates, they face different residual value risks. They often will face different residual values. So think about that for a second. Why might a leasing company, this asset that we've just been talking about is worth we think it's going to be worth $100,000 at the end of 4 years. Why might the leasing company have a different residual value from the clinic?
It wants to lease it. It wants to lease it at renewal. Release.
Well, let's assume that they sell the asset. Why might the leasing company be able to sell the asset? And I'll go ahead.
Because most likely the leasing company has a market for it with many customers. And if you're a hospital, that's not your business, so you will not have as many customers.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's the precise reason.
Wait, say it again.
Leasing company, I say that again, Mark.
So a leasing company is gonna have many customers because it's been selling equipment for many years. And you as a hospital, you take care of patients and you don't have that market. So you're gonna have to sell it to maybe the first customer that you get at a lower price.
Even if you could find a customer sometimes. So leasing companies are very good because this is all they do is buy and sell equipment. They've got customers all over the place, all over the country. They typically can probably get higher residual value prices than the healthcare organization can itself, which as Jorge points out, they are not in the business of buying and selling equipment. That's not their core mission. It's the cost of doing business. Leasing companies, it is fundamental to what they do. Lots of leases have cancellation clauses. Why would they want a clinic? Why would a healthcare organization want a cancellation clause?
Because you have no idea when a technological improvement will happen, and if you need to change your technology to keep up with what is currently offered in the scientific world, then you need the option to get rid of equipment when it becomes obsolete.
Right, that's probably the most common reason for including a cancellation clause. Uncertainty about technology and where it's going. What happens? What is the effect of that cancellation clause on the risk of the lease?
Increase.
To whom?
To the lessor.
To the lessor, because the lessor knows that that piece of equipment I just leased to XYZ healthcare organization, they may be calling me in a couple of years saying, take this worthless piece of junk back. And so that represents a substantial amount of financial risk to me, the lessor. To do that, they will likely impose a penalty, a higher leasing rate, or in fact, sometimes they could require that the asset be held for a minimum amount of time. I'm going to skip over the leveraging the lease because of time. We usually find that owning is less costly than leasing. So then why is leasing used? Well, tax differentials, I've just talked about. Risk reduction, residual value risk, utilization risk we've talked about with the per procedure risk. Project life risk, what does that mean?
Like we were just talking about with the cancellation ability?
Yes, that would be around technology. I guess I'm looking at more of the life of not because of cancellation, but just the uncertainty about a project, how long a project might last.
So if you're leasing the equipment, you know that you will have it for whatever the term of the lease loan is. Because if it breaks, like they have to give you another one. If you own it and it breaks, it's like you cannot continue with your project unless you buy another.
All right, so I'll give you a very practical example of what Jorge's been talking about. Teaching hospital that I worked at once, we spent a year recruiting this world-famous kidney researcher, and one of the demands when we were recruiting him was that he wanted his own lab. And so we refurbished a large area, room in the hospital, put all this high-tech equipment in it, and like a month before he's supposed to show up, he said, I've changed my mind, I'm not coming. So the hospital was stuck with all this equipment that only one person could use. That is an example of where teaching hospitals and academic medical centers in particular, well, even though there was no cancellation and there was no risk of technology change, it was just the fact that there was uncertainty about how long this project, whether the guy would be here 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and then in the end, it turned out he never showed up at all. But again, that's an example of kind of situation where you might want to use lease if there's uncertainty about either whether the project will go ahead or how long it will last. Maintenance services. Why might I want to lease for maintenance services? Isn't maintenance available everywhere? Can anyone think of the circumstances where maintenance may not be readily available?
You're in a rural area, maybe? If you're in a rural area?
Yeah, rural areas typically will not have, master's trained people in biomedical engineering available to service their equipment. It may make sense even for academic medical centers who've got highly specialized equipment. There may be only a few people in the country who know how to maintain the equipment. So even for that kind of equipment, it may make sense to have a maintenance contract. Lower information costs, which is essentially the same thing as what we were talking about a minute ago, that leasing companies have a small medical group practice, may go to their local bank and say, will you write a lease for me for some ultrasound equipment? And the bank may say, what? I don't even know what ultrasound equipment is. But if they go to a leasing company that specializes in small medical group practices, they can probably, they will be familiar with the type, what the equipment is used for, what it's worth, and so on, and they may be able to process the lease at a much lower cost than a bank and with greater knowledge.
Yeah, if you're purchasing a very expensive specialized piece of equipment, don't they usually have a maintenance service or plan that can come with this item even if you are purchasing it?
You can, and sometimes, like, again, large academic medical centers, they will have a department of biomedical engineering, and they'll have 15, 20 engineers in there, and all they do is go around, calibrate, and maintain very expensive, very technologically complex equipment. So it's a cost benefit. Do we hire our own? It's the same. Do we purchase and buy and hire our own, or do we rent out and get it? And the answer is, it depends on the type of equipment, supply of labor, and so on. The lower risk in bankruptcy because lessors are higher on the pecking order than banks. So if your organization goes bankrupt, lessors get paid before banks do. Therefore, lessors tend to be less risk averse when it comes to organization lending, writing leases to financially unstable organizations. So that's another reason why leasing could be used if your balance sheet doesn't look as good. There are 3 kinds of myths in the lease analysis. Sometimes higher residual values. If you know that you're going to be able to sell that asset for $500,000 instead of the $100,000, that would make leasing less attractive. That's a myth. Why? In other words, if you have all those numbers the same, and the residual value is $500,000 instead of $100,000, or would that make you change your mind? Why I claim that's a myth? Why?
Because of the taxes you pay on that capital gain?
What will the bank do? What will the leasing company do in response to that high residual value?
Increase
Lower your
Yeah. There's Rochelle, you want to say?
I was going to say they could pass, if they're going to get a higher residual value, then they could decrease their leasing rates and pass on some of those savings.
Exactly. So the competition, and again, the leasing companies and the lenders all know the estimated residual values of these, and they will build that into their leasing payment. So competition amongst lenders and leasing companies probably makes this a myth. Secondly, it increases creditability because it's off-balance sheet financing. And this is the issue that I was talking about with the accountants. Are investors deceived by having footnotes instead of having it right on the liability side of the balance sheet? And finally, leasing preserves liquidity. You'll see on the study I showed a minute ago, one of the advantages of leasing is that it avoids cash outlays. You don't have to use your cash. You can just lease and then make the payments. But again, I claim that as a myth because you can also borrow and make the payments. So there's not really a clear advantage of one over the other for that reason. Okay, that's the contents of what I wanted to talk about. Are there any questions or comments at this point?